This is a basic introduction to the different elements of fairy tales, fables, and myths. Let's start with fairy tales. First of all, what is a fairy tale? A fairy tale is a fictional story written for children about magic and enchantment. These stories are made up, meaning that they are not true. Examples of fairy tales include Sleeping Beauty, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, The Princess and the Pea, and Hansel and Gretel. These are well-known stories that we've all grown up with. What makes a story a fairy tale? Let's have a basic look at the elements of a fairy tale. First of all, fairy tales all begin with once upon a time, and they end with they lived happily ever after. The characters in fairy tales are all made up magical creatures, like fairies, goblins, elves, trolls, witches, giants, princes, princesses, dwarfs. There's usually a good character and an evil character. The themes of fairy tales often include magic, royalty. The setting is where the story takes place. Often fairy tales take place in castles or even woods and forests. When is usually once upon a time and maybe a time of day, such as midnight. In the plot of a fairy tale, we usually have a problem. Something bad happens to the good character, and usually the bad character is responsible for this. The solution comes about when the good character is either saved or rewarded for being good. Let's look at an example of a fairy tale, The Three Elves and the Baby. Once upon a time there was a poor girl who worked as a maid in a castle. One morning while she was cleaning she found a letter. It was a letter from three elves who asked the girl to kidnap the princess's baby for them. The girl did not want to do this, but she was afraid of the elves. She kidnapped the baby for them, and the elves put another child in its place. Already we can start to identify parts of the fairy tale. We see that it begins with once upon a time, which also gives us our setting. It was once upon a time in a castle. The characters are the girl and the three elves. The three elves came and took the girl and the baby to a magic hollow mountain where the elves lived. The girl wanted to go home, but the elves begged her to stay with them for 3 days. So she stayed, and the elves did everything they could to make her happy. When she got back to the castle, she thought she had been with the elves for 3 days, but she had been there for 7 years. The princess was worried because her child grew but looked nothing like her, and her friends told her the elves had taken her true child. In her trouble, she went to a witch and asked her advice. The witch said that she should take the child outside under the full moon and tickle the child to make him laugh. The elves loved the sound of children's laughter. As the child was laughing, the elves came and took the laughing child and brought back the princess's true child. The princess lived happily ever after with her true child. From here we can identify the problem, solution, and ending. I'm not going to give you the problem and solution, you have to think of that for yourself. However, we can see the ending in the last line. The princess lived happily ever after with her true child. And this is an example of a typical fairy tale. Next we are going to look at fables. So what is a fable? A fable is a short fictional story written for children with animals as characters and ending with a moral. Examples of fables include The Fox and the Grapes, The Lion and the Mouse, The Tortoise and the Hare, The Fox and the Crow. We may not know these exact fables, but we all know at least one fable from our childhood. The elements of a fable. All fables contain a moral, which is a good lesson for us to learn from. The story outlines the benefit of following the moral, so what is good about being patient, and there are consequences of not following the moral. There's a good or wise character who follows the moral, who is often the hero. Sometimes this character is not who you would expect it to be. There is also a lazy or foolish character who does not follow the moral and needs to learn the lesson. This person is often portrayed as the villain. Fables always have animals as the main characters. For example, a fox, a bear, a snake. Fables also usually happen outdoors or in a countryside setting. Let's have a look at this fable, The Ant and the Grasshopper. In a field one summer's day, a grasshopper was chirping, singing, and hopping about for fun. An ant passed by carrying an ear of corn back to his nest. "Why not come and chat with me?" said the grasshopper, "instead of doing all that work?" "I am helping to store up food for the winter," said the ant, "and suggest you do the same." "Why bother about winter?" said the grasshopper. "We've got plenty of food at the moment." The ant went on its way and continued its work. When the winter came, the grasshopper had no food and was dying of hunger. The ant, however, had plenty of food to last all through the winter from his hard work in the summer. Then the grasshopper knew it is best to be prepared. What do we need to identify? First, let's have a look for the characters. Most fables only have 2 or 3 characters in them. You can usually identify them from the heading, the ant and the grasshopper. You need to look for the good character or the hero, the character that teaches us the moral. And then you need to look for the lazy character, the character who needs to learn the lesson. Then we're going to look for the benefits and consequences of learning this moral. This is all about being prepared, and we learn this by making sure we have food for the winter by preparing in summer. And the moral lesson is exactly what we end with. It is best to be prepared. Next, we are going to have a look at myths. What is a myth? A myth is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining a natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings like gods or goddesses, or events. Examples of myths include Daedalus and Icarus, Romulus and Remus, Nyami and Nyami. These stories are all stories that have been passed down through generation to generation from the different cultures that they come from. The elements of a myth. The characters are gods in the shape of humans or humans with godlike traits. They have supernatural powers. So either the gods have taken on a human form, or a human has been blessed with different godlike traits, such as being able to create fire. The setting is related to the culture and it takes place in the realistic past. This means if you are reading a Greek myth, it will relate to the Greek culture and also take place in the time when Greeks were alive, hence it being the realistic past. There will be lots of action in a myth. Usually myths are full of action and adventure. Many myths offer explanations about how the world began or explanations of a natural phenomenon. Many myths start with the creation of the world. Myths may also focus on difficult tasks or obstacles to overcome. One of the most well-known myths about overcoming obstacles is that of Hercules, who was given different tasks. The plot of the story often focuses on the relationship between humans and gods, or between gods and gods. These relationships are important because they give us a glimpse into the culture. Characters often fulfill their destiny. Again, if we think of Hercules, he was destined to be the son of Zeus, and he had to learn to control his powers to reach that destiny. We have modern-day myths as well, and in these modern-day myths, the gods can actually be superheroes. One of the best examples of this is Thor. Thor is now known as a superhero. However, his myths date back many, many, many years to where he was the god of thunder. Myths are often much longer than fairy tales or fables. Let's have a look at one of the best myths, Pandora's box. Has your curiosity ever got you into trouble? Have you ever been so desperate to know a secret that you took no notice of a warning? All through history there are stories of people being told not to open doors, caskets, cupboards, gates, and all sorts of other things. And in so many of the stories, the people just did not listen. One person who did not listen was Pandora. Her story comes from ancient Greece, and her curiosity brought a whole heap of trouble. In ancient Greece there were two brothers, named Epimetheus and Prometheus. They upset the gods and annoyed the most powerful of all gods, Zeus in particular. This was not the first time humans had upset Zeus, and once before, as punishment, he had taken from humans the ability to make fire. This meant they could no longer cook their meat and could not keep themselves warm. However, Prometheus was clever, and he knew that on the Isle of Lemnos lived Hephaestus, the blacksmith. He had a fire burning to keep his forge hot. Prometheus traveled to Lemnos and stole the fire from the blacksmith. Zeus was furious and decided that humans had to be punished once and for all for their lack of respect. Zeus came up with a very cunning plan to punish the two brothers. With the help of Hephaestus, he created a woman from clay. The goddess Athena then breathed life into the clay. Aphrodite made her very beautiful, and Hermes taught her how to be both charming and deceitful. Zeus called her Pandora and sent her as a gift to Epimetheus. His brother Prometheus had warned him not to accept any gifts from the gods, but Epimetheus was completely charmed by the woman and thought Pandora was so beautiful that she could never cause any harm, so he agreed to marry her. Zeus, pleased that his trap was working, gave Pandora a wedding gift of a beautiful box. There was one very, very important condition, however, that she must never open the box. Pandora was very curious about the contents of the box, but she had promised that she would never open it. All she could think about was, what could be in the box? She could not understand why someone would send her a box if she could not see what was in it. It seemed to make no sense at all, and she could think of nothing else but opening the box and unlocking its secrets. This was just what Zeus had planned. Finally, Pandora could stand it no longer. When she knew Epimetheus was out of sight, she crept up to the box, took the huge key off the high shelf, fitted it carefully into the lock, and turned it. But, at the last moment, she felt a pang of guilt, imagined how angry her husband would be, and quickly locked the box again without opening the lid, and put the key back where she had found it. 3 more times she did this until, at last, she knew she had to look inside, or she would go completely mad. She took the key, slid it into the lock, and turned it. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and slowly lifted the lid of the box. She opened her eyes and looked into the box, expecting to see fine silks, gowns, or gold bracelets and necklaces, or even piles of gold coins. But there was no gleam of gold or treasure. There were no shining bracelets and not one beautiful dress. The look of excitement on her face quickly turned to one of disappointment, and then horror. for Zeus had packed the box full of all the terrible evils he could think of. Out of the box poured disease and poverty. Out came misery, out came death, out came sadness, all shaped like tiny buzzing moths. The creatures stung Pandora over and over again, and she slammed the lid shut. Epimetheus ran into the room to see why she was crying in pain. Pandora could still hear a voice calling to her from the box, pleading with her to be let out. Epimetheus agreed that nothing inside the box could be worse than the horrors that had already been released, so they opened the lid once more. All that remained in the box was hope. It fluttered from the box like a beautiful dragonfly, touching the wounds created by the evil creatures and healing them. Even though Pandora had released pain and suffering on the world, she had also allowed hope to follow them. From this story, we then need to identify characters, setting, obstacles, and what exactly does this myth explain? If you have a look, obstacles in this one would be curiosity. We need to sometimes overcome our curiosity for the greater good. Where is the setting? Is it in the realistic past? There are many more characters in this story than we saw in the fairy tale and the fable. This also means that there are main characters and side characters. What it explains, we need to explain what the story is telling us about. What does it explain? Why is what in the world? If we have a look, the story of Pandora's box is an attempt to explain why we get bad things like disease, poverty, misery, death, and sadness, and the fact that hope can overcome all of these. Remember to go through your stories carefully and have a look at each of these types of stories. Find your favorite one and read it again and again.